Hello there, dear viewers. Are you tired of the same old destinations and eager to explore countries where you'll be greeted with more than just a smile? Look no further, because we've compiled a list of 15 countries where Americans are about as welcome as a camel in a car wash. Brace yourselves for some culture shock and prepare to be the odd one out, literally. Let's jump in and unearth these not-so-welcoming spots on the globe. Shall we? So, where should we begin our journey of unfriendliness? How about Russia? Despite the Cold War being over, the frigid relationship between Americans and Russians continues to chill. Many Russians harbor negative views towards Americans, who they believe meddle in their internal affairs. So, unless you're a fan of icy stares and sub-zero hospitality, you might want to think twice about visiting Russia. Next on our list is Venezuela. Moving on from Russia's cold shoulder, let's skip over to Venezuela, a tropical paradise with a sizzling hot distaste for Americans. Why? Blame it on history. The United States has a track record of meddling in Latin American politics, and Venezuela is no exception. This little fact has bred animosity and distrust towards gringos, and with tensions simmering between these nations, Americans are advised to steer clear of Venezuela, unless you fancy being unwelcome in the land of the Orinoco River and arepas. Speaking of Latin American countries, let's hop over to Cuba. Cuba, home of Havana cigars, vintage cars, and a long-standing grudge against the United States. This Caribbean island has a colorful history with its northern neighbor, and it's safe to say that Americans are not always greeted with open arms or a mojito here. From the Bay of Pigs invasion to the Cuban Missile Crisis, Cuba and the U.S. have had their fair share of run-ins, and that's left a sour taste in the mouths of many Cubans. Next, we take a trip to North Korea, a reclusive nation known for its colorful dear leaders and a distinct dislike for the good old US of A. It's a well-known fact that North Korea's relationship with the United States is as pleasant as a toothache. With a strict government, strict laws, and a strict attitude towards Americans, North Korea is definitely not the place to go if you're looking for a warm welcome. But hey, if you're curious about what an authoritarian regime looks like up close and personal, then by all means, pack your bags and head to Pyongyang. Now, let's hop over to the Middle East and the not-so-friendly Islamic Republic of Iran. This ancient and vibrant country is home to beautiful architecture, delicious food, and a deep-seated distrust of America. With a history of political and economic conflict between the two nations, Iranians aren't particularly fond of Americans. So, unless you enjoy having your passport scrutinized more closely than a detective at a crime scene, you might want to rethink that trip to Tehran. Next up, we've got Iraq. Oh boy, where do we even start with Iraq? Home to some of the oldest civilizations on Earth, it's also been a hotbed of tension between the US and the Middle East for decades. From the Gulf War to the 2003 invasion, America's footprint in Iraq hasn't been a positive one for many Iraqis. Coupled with sectarian violence and instability, Iraqis are more likely to greet Americans with a frown rather than a smile. Moving on from Iraq, we journey to the Democratic People's Republic of Algeria, a nation that's been known to give Americans the cold shoulder. With its history of anti-Western sentiment and its ties to countries that aren't exactly America's best friends, Algeria isn't the most welcoming place for Americans to visit. Just be prepared to dodge some dirty looks if you decide to visit this North African gem. Now, let's hop across the pond to Germany. Germany, land of precision engineering, delicious beer, and, surprisingly, a bit of anti-American sentiment. Despite being a key ally of the United States, Germany has a growing number of people who aren't too keen on the influence of American culture and politics on German society. And while the vast majority of Germans are perfectly pleasant to Americans, you might want to avoid bringing up any controversial topics like, say, the latest American foreign policy debacle if you don't want to end up on the receiving end of a lecture or two. Moving on, let's talk about Turkey. Turkey, the land of baklava, the Bosphorus, and, unfortunately, anti-Americanism. Although the US and Turkey are NATO allies, the relationship between the two nations has been on shaky ground in recent years. From disagreements over the Syrian civil war to disputes over American support for Kurdish groups, there's no shortage of tension between these two nations. And while most Turks are friendly to Americans, you might want to brush up on your diplomacy skills before venturing into Istanbul's Grand Bazaar. Now let's take a quick pit stop in France. France, the home of wine, cheese, and a smidge of anti-Americanism. Despite the long-standing ties between France and the US, some French people can be a bit chilly towards Americans. From the cultural differences to the perception of American hegemony, there's no shortage of reasons why the French aren't always enamored with les Américains. Of course, if you make an effort to speak a little French, appreciate the local culture, and avoid wearing a USA-1-inch t-shirt, you'll probably do just fine in La Belle France. And now, let's take a left turn to Greece, the birthplace of democracy and the feta cheese of anti-American sentiment. While Greece has been an important NATO ally of the US, there are many Greeks who aren't exactly fans of American culture or foreign policy. From the perception of American exceptionalism to disagreements over US involvement in Greek politics, there are certainly some issues to navigate if you're an American visiting Greece. But hey, if you enjoy lively discussions over ouzo and moussaka, then Greece might be the perfect destination for you. On to our next stop on the tour of anti-Americanism, Bolivia, where coca leaves and anti-imperialist sentiments grow in abundance. With a history of US intervention in Latin America, many Bolivians view America with skepticism, if not outright hostility. From the toppling of democratically elected leaders to the perceived economic exploitation of the region, Bolivians have plenty of reasons to be wary of Americans. Moving on from Bolivia, let's head to the scenic, yet sometimes frosty, Republic of Indonesia. While the relationship between Indonesia and the US is generally positive, there's no denying that there's some anti-American sentiment bubbling beneath the surface. From the controversial history of US involvement in Indonesian politics to the perception of American cultural imperialism, Americans might find themselves a bit unwelcome in some parts of this diverse and vibrant country. But hey, if you're into stunning natural beauty and spicy rendang, Indonesia might just be worth the risk of a cold shoulder or two. Next up on our tour of countries where Americans aren't exactly embraced with open arms, China, a land of paradoxes, both ancient and modern. Despite the fact that China is one of America's most important trade partners, the relationship between these two global powers is far from smooth sailing. From disagreements over trade and intellectual property rights to cultural and political differences, China isn't always a warm and fuzzy place for Americans. If you're planning a visit, brush up on your Mandarin, pack your patience, and prepare for some interesting conversations about the state of global politics. Last, but certainly not least, on our whirlwind tour of countries where Americans aren't always welcome, India, the land of the Taj Mahal and the occasional chilly reception. With a population that's generally welcoming to tourists, India might not seem like a hotbed of anti-Americanism at first glance. However, there's a growing sentiment in India that America is a bit too eager to exert its influence on the world stage, which can lead to some less than friendly encounters for American travelers. And that, my friends, concludes our whirlwind tour of the not-so-hot destinations for Americans. From icy receptions in Russia to chilly greetings in France, we've seen it all. But don't despair. With a little cultural sensitivity, a dash of patience, and a whole lot of humor, there's no place that can't be explored and enjoyed, even if you're not exactly the guest of honor. Remember, travel is about experiencing new cultures, expanding your horizons, and sometimes, getting a little uncomfortable.